I'm here to welcome you. A lot of you won't actually know me, but I'm here for 4 or 5 months until Adam comes from America. So he was the appointed minister. I'm the fill-in minister, the supply minister, from February up until the first week of June. So it is me that is welcoming you. Thank you for coming along to our tonight's Gibson Talk, taken by Graham, whose surname I've forgotten. Graham Reading, right. But I know that your topic is peace. Yes, so welcome to you all. My claim to peace is that I registered as a conscientious objector back in 1970. So. Thank you. Welcome.
Well, tonight, as most of you are aware, the very Reverend Dr. Graham Reading is going to speak on religious violence and religious nationalism in a fragmenting world. And this couldn't have come at a more apt moment, I don't think. I think that this is a highly relevant thing. One or two things about Graham is that he really began chaplaincy studies, that department at Otago University, and he is the Douglas Goodfellow Lecturer in Chaplaincy Studies. Now, I've got 2 pages of stuff on Graham, but I'm not going to read the lot, or I'd be here longer than he would be. However, I picked up on a key idea that was in the material about him. New Zealand was an increasingly secular society, but people remained interested in the issues of faith, meaning and spirituality, and events of deep personal significance. Often traumas could trigger such interests. So he has been Master of Knox College. He's also been the principal of the Knox Centre for Ministry and Leadership, the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand's Dunedin-based training centres for ministers and lay readers. And his doctorate came through London University. His book, which I assume came out of the doctoral studies, was Prayer and the Priesthood of Christ in the Reformed Tradition, published in 2003. And he's married to Jenny and has 3 adult children. And on that happy note, I will stop and invite Graham to take the rostrum.
Thank you for the welcome, a very warm welcome to a place that is reasonably familiar to me, having been here on previous Colin Gibson talks. I was asked if I was going to use any visuals tonight, but I figured I couldn't compete with Donald Trump and his latest, so I figured better to go without any visuals rather than try to compete. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge Colin Gibson, in whose memory these lectures are given. His life reflected a deep commitment to public theology, expressed with particular clarity and power through hymnody. It is in that spirit of thoughtful engagement with difficult questions that I offer this address tonight. Religious violence, religious nationalism in a fragmenting world. On the morning of 15 March 2019, worshippers gathered at the El Nur Mosque in Christchurch. It was a Friday. Shoes were left at the door, voices softened, bodies turned towards prayer. There is something profoundly human about such moments, people pausing together to acknowledge something greater than themselves. And then, in an instant, that sacred space became a site of unimaginable violence, a massacre. What struck many observers in the days that followed was not only the horror of the act, but the dissonance it revealed. The attacker claimed to be defending Western civilization. He spoke the language of identity, threat, and belonging. He saw himself in some distorted way as part of a larger struggle. Violence, we are reminded, is really random. It is narrated, it is justified, it is given meaning. And that brings us to the question for tonight. What role does religion play in these narratives of violence, and what alternatives might it offer? I want to begin with what I've elsewhere called the seductive doctrine of exceptionalism, the belief that one's nation stands outside the moral constraints that binds other nations. This belief rarely announces itself in crude terms. It usually comes clothed in the language of virtue. We are defenders of freedom. We are guardians of civilization. We act reluctantly, but necessarily. But beneath this lies a more troubling claim that the moral rules we apply to others do not apply in the same way to ourselves. History, as we know, offers sobering examples. In Nazi Germany, exceptionalism took one of its most extreme forms. The German nation was cast as racially and morally superior, uniquely destined for greatness. This vision was sustained not only by political ideology, but by myth, symbolism, and quasi-religious language. The result was a moral universe in which genocide could be justified as necessary, even righteous. Here, exceptionalism became a claim not only to exemption, but to supremacy. But exceptionalism is not confined to such extremes. In the United States, the idea of American exceptionalism has deep historical roots. From the Puritan vision of a city upon a hill to modern political rhetoric, the nation has often described itself as having a unique role in history, a bearer of freedom, democracy, and moral purpose. And I don't know whether you saw in the Guardian newspaper just 10 days ago an article, and I'll quote from the article, Donald Trump has appointed a so-called alpha male influencer, Nick Adams, to the position of special presidential envoy for American tourism, exceptionalism, and virtue. So there's the word right in the title. The article goes on to say it's unclear what his role will specifically entail, but in a statement shared by Adams, he said, quote, he will play a vital role in revitalising America's diplomatic position as a beacon of free speech, the freedom to worship, and a land of unlimited opportunities for those who align with the traditions and values of the United States of America. Now, at its best, one might say that American exceptionalism has inspired generosity and global responsibility. But it also carries risks, as we are seeing playing out on a daily basis. Because when a nation understands itself as uniquely or supremely virtuous, it can become difficult to subject its own histories and actions to rigorous self-examination. Military interventions, economic policies, and geopolitical strategies can be framed not simply as interests, but as moral imperatives. The line between responsibility and self-justification becomes very blurred. We see another form of exceptionalism in contemporary Russia, where political and religious rhetoric has drawn on the idea of a distinct civilizational identity, a holy Russia called to resist Western moral decline. In this framework, the war in Ukraine is not simply territorial or political, but civilizational. When conflict is framed in such terms, it becomes harder to question, harder to limit, and easier to justify. In the modern state of Israel, we encounter a more complex and deeply charged dynamic. The Jewish people carry a history marked by trauma, displacement, and survival, above all in the Holocaust, and that history must never be minimized. Nor can the establishment of the State of Israel be understood apart from the long story of exile and return that shapes Jewish identity. The modern State of Israel is not only a political reality, but a theological one, bound up with biblical themes of covenant, land, and promise, which those of us who hold to Hebrew scriptures know only too well. These themes speak of belonging and purpose and of a relationship between a people and their God. Yet when such motifs are brought into direct alignment with modern nation-state politics, they take on a different character. Promises of land can become claims of exclusive entitlement. Chosenness can become moral exemption, and the language of destiny can insulate political action from critique. Within the Hebrew tradition itself, of course, there is a powerful counter-voice. The prophets resist any notion that chosenness confers privilege without responsibility. The call is not to simply possess the land, but to live justly within it, to care for the stranger, the widow, and the poor, and to recognize that the land belongs ultimately to God. This is a radically anti-exceptionalist vision. It should intensify moral responsibility rather than exempting it. To name the tension here is not to deny the legitimacy or complexity of Israel's situation, but it is to recognize a recurring human pattern that those who have suffered themselves under the doctrine of exceptionalism are not immune from its temptations or indeed its replication. And so the task of religious self-critique becomes urgent. For whenever theological language is used to shield a nation from moral scrutiny, the ground is prepared for violence to be justified. Closely connected to the issue of exceptionalism is the idea of the just war. The just war tradition, associated with Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, was originally intended to restrain violence. It sought to place moral limits around war, just cause, legitimate authority, right intention, proportionality, last resort, and a reasonable chance of success. This tradition represents an attempt to bring ethical reflection into the most extreme of human actions. The difficulty, however, lies not just in the criteria themselves, but in their application. Who determines whether a cause is just? Who judges whether all peaceful alternatives have truly been exhausted? How is proportionality measured in the fog of war, where consequences are uncertain and often catastrophic? In practice, these criteria are almost always interpreted by those who are already committed to a conflict. The result is that just war reasoning can become less a restraint on violence and more a framework for its justification. That is why in the First and Second World Wars, clergy on all sides assured their nations that their cause was just. Each invoked God. Each claimed moral clarity. Similarly, in the Iraq War of 2003, political leaders framed military action as necessary and justified. A Garrick Tremaine cartoon at the time depicted God holding Saddam Hussein in one hand and George Bush in the other, with the caption that read, "I'd like to have a word with you both about name dropping." The pattern is familiar. We do not go to war because it is just. We declare it is just because we go to war. The deeper problem then is not simply the misuse of just war criteria, but the way they can be absorbed into the very narratives of exceptionalism they were meant to resist. So religion has been implicated in violence, but even more, always an entanglement with power. The Crusades sanctified warfare. Anti-Semitism in Europe drew on distorted theological claims that dehumanized Jewish communities over centuries. In the modern era, Islamophobia has often portrayed Islam as inherently violent, ignoring its diversity and complexity. In the Balkans in the 1990s, religious identity marked divisions, but political ambition drove the conflict. Religion becomes the language through which deeper forces are expressed, which means the question is not simply whether religion causes violence, but how it is used and by whom. Here in Aotearoa, the Christchurch mosque attacks in 2019 revealed how global currents of fear, conspiracy and exclusion can take root locally. But what followed was also remarkable. In the immediate aftermath, the country was galvanised, not in fear, but in solidarity. People gathered in public spaces. Flowers were laid. Headscarves were worn in acts of respect. Calls to prayer were broadcast around the nation. Names were spoken, lives honoured, and grief was shared. There was in those days a kind of moral resolve that gripped the country, a refusal to allow hate to define the moment, a refusal to turn suspicion towards Muslim communities, a refusal to respond to violence with further division. And I do want to add, I thought Jacinda Ardern's leadership in those times was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. What we witnessed was a collective insistence that this act did not represent who we are and would not determine who we would become. It was, in its own way, a public rejection of the narratives that sustain violence, narratives of fear, of cultural threat, of civilizational conflict. And yet, as we also know, such moments do not sustain themselves automatically. They require ongoing vigilance because the ideologies that fuel violence do not disappear, they adapt. They circulate quietly and not so quietly on social media. They find ever new forms to express themselves. Which is why memory matters, not only as remembrance of loss, but as a commitment to resist the patterns that made such violence possible in the first place. And if we look further back into our own history, we find another kind of witness, quieter, less visible, but no less significant. The witness of Archibald Baxter. Baxter, a conscientious objector during First World War, refused to fight. For this, he was imprisoned, beaten, and subjected to brutal treatment. At a time when the language of patriotism, duty, and even divine sanction surrounded the war effort, Baxter's refusal disrupted the moral narrative of his time. He did not offer a grand alternative strategy. He simply refused to participate. And in that refusal, he exposed something important, that what is widely accepted as necessary, even righteous, may in fact be deeply questionable. His witness reminds us that resistance to violence does not always take the form of public protest or political power. Sometimes it takes the form of individual conscience, a stand. If Archibald Baxter represents a personal refusal of violence, the story of Coventry Cathedral offers a communal and ecclesial response to violence and division. After the bombing of Coventry Cathedral in 1940, the cathedral's dean inscribed two simple words on the ruin's charred wall: "Father, forgive." I've got a cross here from Coventry, and it's got the words "Father, forgive" inscribed on it. It did not say, "Father, forgive them," the Germans, as if the problem lay with them, but simply, "Father, forgive," a recognition of shared human brokenness and responsibility. From these ruins emerged what is now known as the Community of the Cross of Nails, a worldwide network inspired by the Coventry story of destruction and renewal, and Knox Church and St Michael's Church on the peninsula are member churches of that community. The worldwide community seeks to live out a threefold commitment that is deeply countercultural in a world shaped by violence and exclusion. First, to heal the wounds of history, bearing witness to pain, remembering past harms honestly, and tending to the long-term work of restoration. Two, learning to live with difference and celebrate diversity, resisting the impulse to homogenize identity and embrace the richness of human plurality as a gift rather than a threat. And three, to build a culture of justice and peace, not merely the absence of conflict, but active, embodied transformation of relationships and structures that sustain inequality and harm. These commitments guide ongoing practices, praying a litany of reconciliation together on a regular basis, nurturing global partnerships, engaging in grassroots reconciliation work in contexts as diverse as Germany, South Africa, and North America. They remind us that reconciliation is a lifelong task and pilgrimage, one that refuses simple binaries of victim and perpetrator, friend and enemy. It is an ethic that requires us to face our own complicity in patterns of violence before we attempt to negotiate peace with others. There is another historical moment that offers insight. During the Cold War, the world was divided into opposing blocs, East and West, each convinced of its own moral superiority, each viewing the other as a threat. And yet even then, there were those who resisted the logic of division. The name of Paul Oestreicher looms large, as does that of our friend Peter Matheson, who died just a year ago yesterday. Like Paul Oestreicher, Peter was deeply involved in ecumenical and peace movements, fostering dialogue between Christians in the West and those behind the Iron Curtain. At a time when suspicion and ideology dominated, he believed that encounter mattered, that listening across the divides was not naive but necessary. This was not diplomacy in the traditional sense, it was theological conviction. It rested on the belief that no side possessed the whole truth, that reconciliation required relationship. In a world structured by mutual fear, such work may have seemed small, but it was in fact profoundly subversive. It challenged exceptionalism, not by argument alone, but by encounter. And I believe it contributed in no small part to the fall of the Berlin Wall. In a religiously plural world, this insight extends beyond political ideology into the realm of faith itself. The work of dialogue is not only between political blocs, but also between religious traditions. Such dialogue is not merely polite exchange. It involves listening across deep difference, finding common ground, allowing one's assumptions to be questioned, and recognizing the humanity of the other without erasing disagreement. In context shaped by violence, interfaith encounter interrupts narratives of fear and exclusion. The other becomes a neighbour. In this sense, interfaith dialogue is not optional to the work of reconciliation, it is essential. We see this not only on the global stage, but in local contexts as well. Here in Dunedin, the work of the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith Group and the Dunedin Interfaith Council offer quiet but significant witness to the power of sustained dialogue. Through regular conversation, shared initiatives, and the cultivation of trust, these groups create spaces in which difference is engaged with honesty and respect. The contribution of leaders such as Greg Hewson has been especially important in this regard, helping to foster relationships across religious communities and to model a form of engagement grounded not in fear but in mutual recognition. Such work rarely makes headlines, but it is precisely this kind of patient relational labour that undercuts the narratives on which violence depends. Why are these alternative voices so necessary? Because the pressures towards division and fragmentation are real, and almost on a day-by-day basis we're seeing them escalate. In times of uncertainty, identity hardens, fear grows. Religious nationalism offers belonging, but often at the cost of exclusion. We see it globally. Religion becomes less a path of transformation and more a boundary marker. So what is required? Honesty. The ruins of Coventry remind us that no one stands outside the need for repentance. The witness of Baxter reminds us that conscience may require dissent. The example of Peter Matheson reminds us that dialogue is possible, even in conditions of deep division. Violence is sustained by distorted narratives. Truth-telling means resisting them. It means saying, No nation is beyond scrutiny. No cause is above question. Let me end with two images and one with a question about memory. In the ruins of Coventry Cathedral, 3 nails were bound together to form a cross not of triumph but of brokenness. And in Christchurch, names were read aloud, each name a life, each life a world. In a few days' time, we will mark Anzac Day again. We will gather. We will stand in silence. We will say, lest we forget, we will remember them. But who is the them we remember? Is it only those from our own side, the fallen, whose names are inscribed on memorials around the country? Or might our remembering be widened to include not only our dead, but the enemy dead, not only soldiers, but civilians, the nameless victims of collateral damage, not only those who fought, but those who refused to fight, not only the celebrated, but the forgotten? The gospel presses us towards such an expansion of memory. It refuses the comfort of selective remembrance. It calls us to see even the enemy as a neighbour, even the forgotten as worthy of dignity. Between a cross made of nails and names spoken into silence, we are offered a choice. Do we continue to tell the stories that justify violence? Or do we inhabit a counter-narrative, one that honours all who suffer, tells the truth about our histories, and seeks the way of Christ? In a fragmenting world, that choice matters, because the future may depend on whether we can resist the seduction of exceptionalism, question the myths that sustain violence, and recover a faith courageous enough to remember rightly and to make peace. How did Colin put it? He came singing peace. He lived singing peace. He died singing peace. He arose in silence. For the peace to go on, we must make it our song. You and I be the singers. Thank you.
Graham, would you be prepared to take some questions?
Friendly ones.
Anybody who would like to give a question, we would like them to come up here and use this microphone if possible. Well, some people might find it difficult to get up.
We want to see people's faces so other people can see them, please. You have body language as well as your words. Ask a question. Okay.
So, have we got anybody who is willing to give a question or so? Please come up.
In London, I used to attend the proms, and one of the guests was an orchestra called the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, started by Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim. And in a pre-prom talk, which they used to have before the event itself, some of the young people in the orchestra, because they were all young, talked a little bit about their experience, and they said, well, when we first met, we didn't even want to have morning tea with them, let alone sit next to them and make music. And then they realised they had to share the music, and it took a while, but gradually they began to talk, and really what they said was, we discovered they were other young people just like us. Now, I didn't fully read Edward Said's book, but he doesn't believe in a two-state solution. And these young people were Jewish people and Arab people and Muslim. They were a big collection, and they were their parents were mortal enemies, really. One of the things that used to trouble me watching the news was to see young children on the shoulders of their fathers at the protests. It really bothered me. I knew why it bothered me, because this is a generational thing, and if we don't interrupt it, I don't know what we're going to do. But you said something interesting. You talked about land. And of course, unfortunately, as we can see so clearly in Israel and Gaza, this is all about land. And Trump is a lot about resources. So what do you do in a secular world where, you know, this is where they're coming from? Anyhow, sorry, that's rather complicated.
No,
but the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, they now practice in Spain. Spain has given them space to practice, and they meet there every year.
Your question does prompt further reflection about how the land is to be understood theologically as well as historically. And as we all know, it is a very, very complex thing that goes right back to biblical times with the promise of the land. And the biblical mandate to occupy the land and to make space for the stranger and those who were different was always one that ancient Israel wrestled with and often failed at. And that's why the judgment was often pronounced by the prophets, because they had failed the covenantal obligation that was given to them. Fast forward to more modern times, ever since the foundation of the modern state of Israel, that land is now theirs, they occupy it. But I think what the world is still waiting for is for that biblical mandate to still be fulfilled, of being a spacious and gracious place for those inhabitants who are indigenous to that area, even though they might not be Jewish. Now, I'm not a politician or an academic on this, on the pros and cons of a two-state solution. But the way forward, I believe, will be when each of the religious traditions, whether it be Jewish, whether it be Muslim, or whether it be Christian, actually is able to repent of their own contribution to the warfare, the suspicion, and the divide. At the moment, each one is arguing from a point of self-proclaimed righteousness.
Looking at the other.
Pointing at the other and blame. And so you've got generations of enmity that are simply being fueled. And it won't be until there is that, and the whole thrust of my paper is there has to be an honest self-reckoning and self-appraisal. Until that time, I believe, everything's going to be papering over the cracks.
Yep, I agree. Yeah.
So it's not a political solution, I think it's a theological one.
No, I agree. Yes, thank you.
Can I give you a hand?
Rex.
Not so much a question, but a thank you. That resonated. Now, 50-odd years ago, I was at war. It was a war that we should never have been involved with. Obviously, I'm talking about the Vietnam War. And it comes down not so much to the forces involved, but to the individuals. And the most profound experience of that was we captured the paymaster and the medic of D445 Infantry Regiment in Vietnam. And our padre, wonderful man, who kept us on the straight and narrow, confiscated all the money for the orphanage that the Australian Army were building. And so he allowed us a few dollars. And we spent 6 weeks in the bush at a time, in the jungle, and 3 days in Vung Tau. And during the 3 days in Vung Tau after that, we were enjoying ourselves, drinking and having a meal, and there were all these chaps around of military age, And we realised they were the other side, the others. And they were looking rather sad about this because they had no money. And so we invited them for a meal and a drink. And from that time, we never encountered them in the jungle again. For me, the Vietnam War, and this is personal, it was about protecting the locals from the Viet Cong, from the North Vietnamese Army, and ensuring that they lived peaceful lives. And to me, that was a worthwhile cause in a very unworthwhile conflict. My last month in Vietnam, I spent working on that orphanage, looking after the children, while the Australians built the buildings. And I felt that in a horrible war, I actually did something worthwhile. And I am still working on that now. And Graham and I had a cup of coffee the other day because he wrote an article in the paper about just war, and it resonated, as did this lecture tonight. Thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much.
Have we any other question statements? Greg.
Yes, you began, Graham, by referring to the image of Donald Trump, which in the age of social media and AI, you know, most of us have seen it, even though it was only created about 48 hours ago. And in some of the military reports that Trump has authorised, they intersperse between actual war footage and AI-generated warmongering drama. So there's a blur between reality and AI-generated reality. So this is a whole new dynamic of media that we haven't had in the world before. And I just wonder if you've got any thoughts about how this mixture of AI reality and reality might affect people's horror about war, because it seems to me a lot of people have become familiar with the games and the AI, and when they see the two played one after the other, it tends to just downplay the horror of it somehow.
Yeah, downplays the horror and also makes even more difficult the task of discerning what is true.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the old adage that the first casualty of war is truth is now amplified with AI.
Yeah.
It's not just the propaganda, it's the whole AI production that's going on around it. The doctoring of photos and all the rest of it. So what is true in that context? And I think that's, you know, when I talk about the need for honesty, part of it is saying truth does matter. We don't simply accept that that's an inevitable consequence of war. We live in the truth and must hold to the truth as much as we are able. And that means resisting what appears to be on the surface often plausible narratives, but which are undergirding the acts of violence. So thanks, Greg.
But Trump has actually generated an image of himself which he says is of a doctor, not of Jesus. But my sister, who's a nurse in the United States, is really angry about Trump portraying himself as a doctor because he's not helping people. He's having the opposite effect. Yet here he is boosting his own ego by putting himself in his own AI-generated image, which is providing a huge amount of fuel for interpretation for theologians and no doubt for historians. Very sad.
Thank you.
Speaking as not a war commemorations historian, simply a commemorations historian, I want to reflect back on what you had to say, the noble words about Jacinda Ardern. If you've seen the Netflix piece, which is running right at the moment, on Jacinda and the good days she went through, the horrible days that caused the good days, the massacre followed by her embracing of Islamic families who were full of sorrow about what had happened to their religion and their people. And then we get COVID. And this whole business is very close to us. She struggled with Dr. Bloomfield to cope with COVID. And in the first 2 rounds, she did marvellously well. Overall, she did as well, just about, as Iceland, one of the top countries for not catching COVID. But the backlash came in the 3rd round in 2023, and it culminated with that horrible business on the Parliament grounds, where hate was engendered, dispute was engendered, striking out and violence was engendered. How we turn away from that kind of abuse, I'm not quite sure yet, but we have to move as a country away from that. Otherwise, we will go down the exceptionalist field, exceptionist way, and we don't need to. We have no need to.
Thank you, George. Just on the note of, I guess, reconciliation and resources and all the rest, those of you that know me will know that I'm a great fan of this collection of Peter Matheson's poetry. And I've got some copies there. The Knox church folk that are here will be familiar with it, but for those of you that are from other church traditions, if you haven't seen Peter's collection, I've got a dozen copies there. You can talk to me about purchasing them afterwards if you like. But he was a wonderful advocate for peace and reconciliation.
Just in time. Of course.
I have a question that's bothered me for a long time, and you sort of alluded to Archibald Baxter and people who did their own personal protest in a way, and all of us here could do a personal protest, and it's a few years ago Mary and I were in Germany and we had bikes and we were in Rudesheim, just a tiny wee town, and we were in the back streets of this tiny town, and we came around a corner and there was a war memorial with it newly done up with all the names of the boys on it who'd died in the Second World War, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and I just cried. It just looked like Mossburn or Tiana or Lumsden or, and see, mothers and fathers know all this, don't they? I mean, mothers and fathers all object to this, and the world's full of mothers and fathers. What can we do to stop a few isolated men saying that we have to fight when all of us don't want to? What can we do?
Well, that's a timeless question I don't know that I can answer. But one of the most moving things that I found was to visit the Ataturk Memorial in Wellington, and the words that were inscribed on that from the Turkish side, where they were acknowledging the fallen Anzacs on their soil, but assuring us, the enemy, that they were resting in peace and were regarded as brothers. I think it's that extraordinary gesture where the old lines of conflict do not harden into eternal lines of separation. We're able to see the humanity in the other. And the example that you gave, I think, is very similar. You go over to some of these other countries that were once enemies and you see they grieve as we grieve. They're looking for some kind of remembrance and hope that will say this will never happen again. And the church has, in its liturgical and music tradition and in its preaching tradition, the resources that can actually shape a community of difference that imagines things differently. But as you also know, the church is often complicit in the very thing it speaks out against. So it's a tough one.
Is it mothers, cry not? Your sons are buried in a friendly country.
Correct. Yeah.
Which are words attributed to, may I underline that, Kemal Ataturk, who wasn't Kemal Ataturk at the time, that it was allegedly written. I could give you a whole lecture on this, but I won't. Already done that in the Hocken Library. But the words are beautiful. I say that as a somewhat hard-nosed New Zealander on poetry. The words are just beautiful. There's no other way I can describe it. Whether Mustafa Kemal wrote them in 1934, I really dispute that, 1934, because the first came out in about 1961, an English translation. You can't hide them for that long if they're that. And the major biographers of Ataturk don't recognise those words at all. So, whoever wrote them, thank you. Thank you in retrospect for the millions of people who have been influenced by those words. Rod.
It's my pleasure to offer a thanks to you, Graham. I've watched people coming up here and they've been triggered off to memories of experiences that are quite deep and I guess if we went right round, we would end up having stories that you've triggered. And for me, I was born in 1942. Mum named me Roderick George. Roderick after her brother who was killed in the war. George, her father who died during the war. And so I have that connection. And I guess many others out here will have been triggered with what you've shared. And you're inviting each one of us to look at our stories and not turn them into violence, but to, in a sense, look at them carefully and treat them as a reminder of peace. So thank you indeed.
Watch this space 2 months hence. Can't tell you who it is, I'm still trying to get them into place. But that'll be June, probably the third week in June. Looking forward to seeing you again.